A kingdom once fell in a single night. A king was killed, a palace burned, and a child disappeared. For years, the world believed the royal bloodline was gone. But far from the throne, a servant was growing into something far greater than anyone imagined. This is the story of the prince who returned. The kingdom of Valina slept beneath a quiet sky, its towers silver in the moonlight and its streets calm under the watch of distant lanterns. Inside the palace, King Aldrich stood at a high window, looking over the city that trusted him. Peace had lasted many years, but lately it felt fragile, like glass before it breaks. Behind him, Queen Elira held their infant son, Rowan. The child slept peacefully, his small hand curled against her shoulder, unaware of the danger already moving toward him. Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor. A captain burst into the chamber, breathless, smoke staining his armor and fear plain in his eyes. "Your Majesty, the eastern gate has fallen." The king turned slowly. "Victor?" he asked. The captain lowered his head. "Yes, sire." Flames began to rise beyond the palace walls, painting the sky red and sending distant cries drifting through the night air. The rebellion had begun, and it was already too close. The captain stepped forward urgently. "You must flee, Your Majesty. There is still time." Aldrich shook his head. "A king does not flee his throne." Then his eyes fell on Rowan. For a moment, the weight of the crown seemed heavier than ever before, and sorrow crossed his face. "Take the child," he said quietly to the queen. "If the line must fall, let it not fall tonight." Queen Elira's hands trembled, but she nodded. A hidden passage beneath the palace was opened, and a loyal servant woman named Mara was chosen to carry the prince away into the darkness. Elira kissed her son's forehead. "Live," she whispered, her voice breaking. Moments later, the gates of the palace shattered, and the sound of steel filled the halls. That night, the crown of Valina fell, and the last prince vanished into the darkness. Morning came quietly to the small border village of Rensford, far from the burning towers of Valina. Mist lay over the fields, and the world seemed peaceful, as if no kingdom had fallen the night before. Mara walked along the narrow road, her cloak drawn tight, the infant Rowan sleeping against her chest. She had not slept since leaving the palace. Every sound behind her felt like pursuit, every shadow like a soldier. But none came. By midday, she reached a modest stone house at the edge of the village. It belonged to her brother, a blacksmith who asked no questions when he saw her trembling hands and the child she carried. In troubled times, silence was often the greatest kindness. Rowan grew there, not as a prince, but as the son of a servant. The villagers knew him only as a quiet boy who helped carry water, stack firewood, and run errands through the dusty lanes. No one saw a crown in him. No one bowed. Mara never told him the truth. She kept the only proof hidden, a small ring bearing the royal seal, wrapped in cloth and locked in a wooden chest. Some nights she would hold it, remembering the palace, the queen's tearful whisper, and the sound of distant flames. Years passed, and the boy grew strong. Rowan learned to work with his hands, to listen more than he spoke, and to watch the world carefully. There was a calm steadiness in him, something older than his years, though no one could say why. Far away, Lord Victor crowned himself King of Valina, and the memory of Aldrich's line faded into rumor and ash. But in a quiet village, a boy lived who carried the blood of kings and did not yet know it. Rowan was 10 years old when he first began to feel that he did not quite belong. It was not something he could explain. The village was kind enough, and Mara cared for him as fiercely as any mother. Yet sometimes, when he watched the blacksmith's sons laughing or the farmer's children running through the fields, he felt as if he stood just outside their world, looking in. He was stronger than boys his age, quicker to learn, slower to anger. When disputes broke out among the children, Rowan often stepped between them, speaking calmly until the shouting faded. Even the adults noticed it. "He carries himself strangely," one of the elders once said. "Not like a village boy." Mara heard those words and felt a chill of fear. That night, after Rowan had fallen asleep, she opened the wooden chest beneath her bed and took out the ring. The metal caught the candlelight, the royal seal still sharp and clear. For years she had hidden it, telling herself the past was gone. But the past was not gone. It was growing. Outside, the wind moved softly through the village, carrying distant echoes of a larger world, a world Rowan knew nothing about. In Valina, King Victor ruled with a hard hand. Taxes grew heavier, soldiers marched more often, and whispers of unrest began to travel through the countryside. Travelers spoke carefully, glancing over their shoulders even in quiet inns. Rowan listened to those stories when merchants passed through the village. Something stirred in him when he heard the name Valina, a strange pull he could not understand. One evening, he asked Mara quietly, "Have you ever seen the capital?" Mara's hands froze. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Long ago." Rowan studied her face, sensing there was more she would not say. And for the first time, he began to wonder who he truly was. The first soldiers Rowan ever saw arrived on a grey afternoon. They rode into Rensford in worn armor, their cloaks marked with the crest of Valina, Victor's crest, not the old king's. The villagers fell silent as the horses stopped in the square. Soldiers rarely brought good news. A captain dismounted and read a decree in a loud, tired voice. New taxes. More grain to be taken before winter. Any who refused would be punished. The blacksmith's sons clenched their fists, but no one spoke. The soldiers had swords, and hunger was quieter than death. Rowan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He felt anger rise in him, not wild anger, but something colder and heavier. The captain's voice sounded wrong to him, as if the words themselves carried injustice. When the soldiers began loading sacks of grain onto their wagon, a farmer stepped forward, trembling. "That is all we have," the man said. "Our children will starve." The captain looked at him without sympathy. "Then pray winter is kind." The farmer reached for the wagon, desperate. A soldier struck him down with the flat of his blade. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. Rowan did. Before he could think, he stepped forward and helped the farmer to his feet. The soldier who had struck the blow stared at him, surprised. "Careful, boy," the soldier said. "This is not your concern." Rowan met his eyes, calm but unafraid. "It is," he said quietly. For a moment, the square was silent. Then the captain turned away, uninterested in wasting time on a village child. The wagons rolled out, leaving dust and fear behind. That evening, Mara said nothing, but she watched Rowan closely. Something had awakened in him that day. Not anger, but a sense of right and wrong that refused to stay silent. That night, the village was quieter than usual. The visit of the soldiers had left a weight in the air, as if even the wind moved more carefully. Rowan sat outside the small house, staring at the dark fields. The image of the farmer falling replayed in his mind. He could not explain why it troubled him so deeply, only that something inside him refused to accept it as normal. Mara watched him from the doorway. She had seen that look before, not in Rowan, but in another man, many years ago, standing in a palace lit by torches. A king who believed justice mattered. Fear settled in her chest. When Rowan finally went to sleep, Mara lit a candle and knelt beside the wooden chest beneath her bed. Her hands hesitated before opening it, as if she already knew what she would find. Inside lay the ring. The metal was cool in her palm, the royal seal still clear despite the passing years. She closed her fingers around it, remembering the Queen's trembling voice, the roar of flames, and the weight of a promise she had never broken. "Keep him safe," Elira had said. Mara looked toward the door where Rowan slept. He was no longer a child who could be hidden forever. The world was changing, and sooner or later, it would reach him. Outside, the night wind carried distant sounds from the road, travelers, wagons, whispers of unrest spreading across the kingdom. Victor's rule was growing harsher, and people were beginning to speak in low voices of resistance. Mara closed the chest and extinguished the candle. The truth, she knew, could not remain buried forever. And when Rowan learned who he was, his life would never be simple again. Winter came early that year, and with it came travelers seeking warmth wherever they could find it. One evening, as snow began to fall, a stranger arrived in Rensford. He was an older man, cloaked in dark wool, his boots worn from long roads. He carried no sword, yet there was something in the way he walked, steady, alert, that made Rowan notice him at once. The stranger stopped at the forge to warm his hands near the fire. Rowan was there, helping the blacksmith shape iron into nails. Sparks rose into the cold air as the hammer struck. "You work well," the stranger said after a while, watching Rowan's careful movements. Rowan shrugged slightly. "It's just work." The man studied him more closely, as if searching for something. "What is your name?" "Rowan." For a brief moment, the stranger's expression changed, so quickly that Rowan almost thought he imagined it. "A good name," the man said quietly. That night, the stranger stayed in the village, and Mara felt unease she could not explain. When she saw him speaking with Rowan the next morning, her heart tightened. Later, the stranger approached her alone. "You have raised him well," he said softly. Mara froze. "I don't know what you mean." The man reached into his cloak and drew out a small piece of metal, a broken seal bearing the faded mark of Valina. "I served King Aldric," he said. "And I have spent years searching for what was lost." Mara's hands trembled. "The world is changing," the stranger continued. "And the boy deserves to know who he is, before others discover it first." Snow fell silently around them, and Mara understood that the past she had hidden for so long had finally found its way back. Mara did not sleep that night. The stranger's words echoed in her mind long after the village had fallen silent. She knew the day would come when Rowan must learn the truth, but she had hoped it would be far in the future, not now, when he was still young, still unprepared for the weight of it. At dawn, she called Rowan inside. He sat across from her at the small wooden table, watching her with quiet concern. He had never seen her so pale. "There is something you must know," Mara said softly. "Something I should have told you long ago." Rowan listened, confused but calm. Mara opened the wooden chest and placed the ring in front of him. The metal gleamed in the morning light, the seal unmistakable even to a village boy who had only seen such symbols in travelers' stories. "This belonged to your father," she said. Rowan frowned. "My father was a laborer." "You told me so." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "I told you what I had to keep you safe." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. "You are not a servant's son, Rowan," she said. "You are the son of King Aldrich, the rightful heir of Valina." For a long moment, Rowan said nothing. The words seemed too large to understand, like trying to hold the sky in his hands. "The king is dead," Mara continued quietly. "The palace burned. I carried you away before Victor's men could find you. The world believes the royal line ended that night." Rowan looked down at the ring in his palm. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been. Outside, the village moved as it always had, children running, hammers striking iron, smoke rising from chimneys. But for Rowan, everything had changed. And the life he had known was already beginning to fade. Rowan spent the day in silence. The village moved as it always had, smoke rising from chimneys, carts creaking along the road, children laughing in the cold air, but it all felt distant, as if he were watching a life that no longer belonged to him. That evening, he walked to the edge of the fields where the hills stretched toward the horizon. The stranger stood there, as if expecting him. "You know," the man said quietly. Rowan nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of snow. "What happens now?" Rowan asked. "That depends on you," the stranger replied. "Some men would hide. Some would forget. But a few choose to face what they are meant to become." Rowan looked down at his hands, rough from years of work. They did not look like the hands of a prince. "I don't know how to be a king," he said. The stranger gave a faint, tired smile. "No one ever does. They only learn how to be worthy of the crown." That night, Rowan sat beside Mara near the fire. The truth had placed a distance between them, but not a cold one, only the quiet understanding that everything was changing. "If I stay," Rowan said at last, "Victor will rule forever." Mara closed her eyes, knowing what he was about to say. "I have to leave," he continued. "I have to learn, and one day, I have to return." Tears filled Mara's eyes, but she nodded. She had carried him from a burning palace to give him a chance to live. She could not now ask him to live without purpose. At dawn, Rowan stepped onto the road. And for the first time in his life, he walked not as a servant, but as a prince without a crown. The road beyond Rensford was longer and harsher than Rowan had imagined. For days he travelled with the stranger, whose name he now knew was Sir Thomas, once a captain in King Aldrich's guard. Thomas spoke little, but he watched everything, the road, the travellers, the distant ridgelines, as if danger might rise from any shadow. Rowan learned quickly that the world beyond the village was not gentle. Inns were filled with whispers of Victor's rule, of taxes that broke families, of soldiers who enforced laws without mercy. Fear moved through the kingdom like a slow, spreading winter. "You must learn more than how to fight," Thomas told him one evening beside a small fire. "A king must see what others suffer. Only then can he rule justly." Rowan listened. The stories of farmers losing land and merchants losing homes stirred something deep within him, not anger alone, but a quiet determination. They traveled south to a remote valley where a small group of former soldiers lived in hiding. There, Rowan began to train. He learned the weight of a sword, the discipline of patience, and the importance of control. Thomas was strict but fair, correcting every careless movement, every moment of hesitation. "Strength without discipline is useless," he said. "And discipline without purpose is empty." Weeks turned into months. Rowan's hands hardened, his movements sharpened, and the uncertainty within him slowly gave way to resolve. One night, standing beneath a sky filled with cold stars, Rowan realized something. He was no longer running from the past. He was preparing to face it. As the seasons passed, Rowan's training continued, but Thomas did not keep him hidden forever. "You must see what Victor has done," Thomas said one morning. "Not from stories, from your own eyes." They traveled in disguise, moving from village to village across the kingdom. Rowan saw fields left barren because farmers could not afford seed, saw men taken for forced labor on distant fortifications, and saw soldiers collecting taxes with cold indifference. In one town, a young boy no older than Rowan had been when he left Rensford stood beside an empty stall, trying to sell the last of his family's grain. When Rowan asked where his father was, the boy answered simply, "Taken." That night, Rowan could not sleep. "The kingdom is breaking," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Yes. And the people know it. But fear keeps them silent." In the capital of Valina, Victor ruled from the throne that had once belonged to Aldrich. His son, Prince Lucan, had grown into a proud and restless young man, eager to prove his strength and loyalty. Together, they tightened their grip on the realm, believing resistance had been crushed long ago. But whispers were beginning to spread again, quiet rumors of men who still remembered the old king, and of a rightful heir who might yet live. Rowan heard those whispers as they traveled. Each one felt like a distant echo calling him forward. Standing on a hill overlooking a valley filled with villages, Rowan understood at last what his path must be. He would not return as a wandering exile. One day, he would return to reclaim what had been taken. Whispers alone could not change a kingdom. Thomas knew this, and Rowan began to understand it as well. A crown was not reclaimed by one man, no matter how rightful his claim might be. It would take people, men and women who still believed the kingdom deserved better. Their first allies were the soldiers in the valley where Rowan had trained. They were not many, and they were not powerful, but they remembered King Aldrich's rule and the peace that had once existed. When Thomas finally revealed Rowan's identity, silence filled the camp. At last, an older soldier stepped forward. "If you truly are Aldrich's son," he said, "then I will follow you, or not for the crown, but for the kingdom." One by one, the others agreed. It was not a grand moment. There were no cheers, no banners, no oaths shouted to the sky. Only quiet voices and steady hands clasped in agreement. That night, Rowan sat beside the fire, listening as the men spoke of their homes, of families struggling under taxes, of villages losing hope. He realized that what they wanted was not revenge, but justice. "We cannot rush this," Thomas told him later. "If we rise too soon, we will be crushed. We must move carefully, gathering strength, helping the people quietly, letting the kingdom remember what it once was." So they began to travel again, not as fugitives, but as something else, something quieter, more patient. A small circle of resistance began to grow. And for the first time since the night the crown fell, hope began to return. The resistance did not grow through battles. It grew through small, careful acts that few noticed at first. Grain taken by tax collectors was quietly returned during the night. Prisoners were freed from transport wagons when guards were distracted. Messages moved from village to village, carried by farmers, merchants, and travelers who spoke little but remembered everything. Rowan traveled among them, not as a prince, but as a man who listened. He sat in humble homes, shared meals beside dim fires, and heard the stories of people who had endured years of fear. Each story deepened his resolve. "They do not need a conqueror," Rowan said to Thomas one evening. "They need someone who will stand for them." Thomas nodded. "And that is why they will follow you." In the capital, however, Victor began to sense that something was changing. Reports reached him of missing tax shipments, of soldiers attacked in lonely places, of villages that no longer obeyed as quickly as before. "Bandits," Prince Lucan said dismissively. Victor was not so certain. "Bandits do not organize," the king replied. "Someone is guiding them." Orders were given to increase patrols and tighten control. More soldiers marched through the countryside, but the resistance simply moved elsewhere, spreading like a hidden flame that could not be stamped out. One night, standing on a ridge overlooking the lights of a distant town, Rowan realized how far he had come. He was no longer the boy who carried water in Rensford. He was becoming something else, someone the kingdom was beginning to believe in. And the day when he would have to step out of the shadows was drawing closer. Winter returned, and with it came harsher winds and longer nights. The resistance continued its quiet work, but the kingdom was changing faster now. Patrols doubled, checkpoints appeared on the roads, and travelers were questioned more closely than before. Victor's suspicion had turned into certainty. "There is a leader behind this," he said to Lucan in the great hall. "Someone patient enough to weaken us slowly." Lucan leaned forward, restless and eager. "Then let us crush them openly. Send the army. Burn the villages that shelter them." Victor studied his son for a long moment. "Fear can rule for a time," he said at last, "but it also breeds rebellion. We must find their leader first." Spies were sent across the countryside, listening in taverns and markets, watching for signs of unusual movement. Rumors began to circulate of a young man traveling with former soldiers, a man who spoke little but was always obeyed. The whispers reached Rowan's camp within weeks. "They are looking for you," Thomas said quietly. Rowan stared into the fire, thinking of the people they had helped, of the fragile hope beginning to rise. If he were captured now, everything would collapse. "Then we must move more carefully," Rowan replied. "And prepare for the day when hiding is no longer possible." Far away in the capital, Victor stood on the palace balcony, looking over the city he controlled but did not truly trust. Somewhere beyond the walls, an unseen enemy was growing stronger. And for the first time in years, the king felt the cold touch of uncertainty. The day hiding ended came sooner than anyone expected. A column of Victor's soldiers marched toward a small farming town that had quietly aided the resistance for months. Word reached Rowan before the soldiers arrived. If the town fell, dozens would be imprisoned, and many more would starve before winter ended. Rowan stood with Thomas and the others at the edge of a forest overlooking the road. For years they had worked in shadows, avoiding open battle, but this time there was no choice. "If we do nothing," Rowan said, "they will suffer for helping us." Thomas studied him carefully. "Once we fight openly, there is no returning to the shadows." Rowan nodded. "I know. They moved at dawn, taking positions along the narrow pass where the road curved between steep hills. When the soldiers entered the pass, arrows fell from above, and the resistance surged forward. It was not a great battle sung by bards. It was quick, fierce, and desperate. Rowan fought beside the men who had trained him, his movement steady, his voice calm even in the chaos. The soldiers, surprised and unprepared, retreated before midday, leaving the road silent except for the wind. The town was saved. But victory brought consequences. Survivors of Victor's forces carried news back to the capital, not only of the resistance, but of the young leader who commanded them. For the first time, the name Rowan began to be spoken openly. And the war that had once been hidden began to take shape in the light. News of the battle in the pass spread faster than Rowan expected. Villagers spoke of it in low voices at first, afraid to believe what they had heard. But as travelers carried the story farther, something began to change. For the first time in years, people spoke not only of Victor's power, but of resistance that could stand against it. And with the story came a name. Rowan. At first it was only a rumor, a whispered guess among those who still remembered the old king. But among former soldiers and older citizens, the name carried a deeper meaning. Some began to wonder if the lost heir of Aldrich might truly be alive. In the capital, the news reached Victor within days. A messenger knelt before the throne, recounting the defeat of the soldiers in the pass and the leader who had commanded the attack. A young man, the messenger said. Calm. Disciplined. The others followed him without question. Victor's expression darkened. And his name. Rowan, Your Majesty. The hall fell silent. Victor rose slowly, memories stirring, of a burning palace, of a child who had vanished into the night. He had believed the royal line ended forever. Find him, the king said quietly. And bring him to me, alive if possible. Prince Lucan stepped forward, his eyes bright with eagerness. Allow me to lead the hunt, father. Victor nodded. Far from the capital, Rowan stood on a hill at sunset, watching the land he had begun to fight for. He did not yet know that his name had reached the throne, or that the king himself was now searching for him. Prince Lucan did not waste time. Within days, he rode from the capital at the head of a hardened company of soldiers, men chosen for loyalty and skill rather than mercy. Unlike his father, Lucan believed fear was the simplest path to control, and he intended to crush the resistance quickly. Villages suspected of aiding Rowan were searched without warning. Roads were sealed, and travelers were questioned harshly. Rumors spread of prisoners taken and never seen again. Rowan heard the news as he and Thomas met with allies in a forest camp. Lucan himself is leading the search, one scout reported. He moves fast, and he leaves nothing behind. Thomas looked at Rowan. He is dangerous. Not because he is reckless, but because he believes completely in what he does. Rowan felt no fear, only a growing sense of urgency. Then we must be faster, he said. We cannot let the people suffer while we wait. Over the next weeks, the resistance changed its movements, breaking into smaller groups, using hidden paths and abandoned roads. Rowan traveled constantly, rarely sleeping in the same place twice. One evening, as the sun sank behind distant hills, Rowan stood beside Thomas on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley below. Soon, Thomas said quietly, you will have to face him. Rowan watched the fading light in silence. He knew the truth of those words. The path he had chosen could only lead in one direction. Toward the throne. And toward the man who hunted him. Lucan found them sooner than expected. It began with smoke on the horizon. A scout rode into Rowan's camp before sunrise, his horse lathered with sweat. A village in the eastern valley, the scout said. Lucan's men arrived at dawn. They're searching every house. Rowan's jaw tightened. That village had sheltered wounded fighters only weeks before. If Lucan discovered that, no one there would be spared. We move now, Rowan said. Thomas studied him. If we rush blindly, we may lose everything. And if we do nothing, Rowan replied, they will lose everything. They reached the village by mid-morning. Smoke still drifted from broken doors and scattered carts. Soldiers stood in the square, questioning the villagers while Lucan watched from horseback, calm and patient. Rowan and his companions waited in the trees beyond the fields, studying the soldiers' positions. It was clear they could not win a direct battle, but they did not need to. Thomas signaled quietly, and the resistance moved. Arrows struck from the tree line, forcing the soldiers to scatter. In the confusion, villagers slipped away through hidden paths the resistance had prepared long ago. By the time Lucan regained control, half the village had vanished into the hills. Fury flashed in the prince's eyes. Rowan watched from the ridge as Lucan turned his horse, searching the hills, sensing that the man he hunted was close. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance. Neither spoke. Neither moved. But both understood. The war between them had truly begun. The rescue of the village spread hope, but it also carried a cost. Lucan's fury did not fade. In the days that followed, his soldiers struck harder, burning abandoned homes, seizing food stores, and punishing any settlement suspected of helping the resistance. Fear returned like a shadow stretching across the land. Rowan rode with Thomas through the countryside, seeing the damage with his own eyes. Fields lay trampled, and families moved along the roads carrying what little they had left. Each sight weighed on him more heavily than any wound. This is what war becomes, Thomas said quietly. Even when fought for justice, it brings suffering. Rowan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then we must end it quickly. But ending it would not be simple. The resistance was growing, but Victor still held the capital, and Lucan's forces remained strong. A single victory would not be enough. The kingdom would have to rise together. That night, Rowan gathered the leaders of the resistance around a small fire. We cannot fight as scattered groups any longer, he said. If we are to end this, we must unite, and we must move toward the capital. The word settled heavily in the silence. Everyone understood what it meant. The quiet war in the shadows was ending. A greater battle was coming, one that would decide the fate of Valina itself. Above them, the stars shone cold and distant. And for the first time, Rowan felt the full weight of the crown he did not yet wear. Word spread across the kingdom in quiet, determined ways. Messengers traveled by night, riders moved along forgotten roads, and old loyalties began to awaken. Farmers who had once hidden in fear now offered food. Former soldiers came forward, bringing their armor, worn but still serviceable. Blacksmiths worked through the night, shaping blades and repairing shields. The resistance was no longer small. Rowan stood on a hill overlooking a growing camp of men and women who had come not for glory, but for hope. Fires burned across the valley like scattered stars, and the sound of quiet voices carried through the night air. Thomas stepped beside him. "You have become what they needed," he said. "A leader?" Rowan shook his head slightly. "I am only the one who stands in front. They are the strength." In the capital, Victor also felt the change. Reports arrived daily, villages no longer obeying, soldiers deserting, and the resistance gathering openly for the first time in years. "They are preparing for war," Lucan said, studying a map spread across the table. Victor looked at the marked roads and valleys, his expression grave. "Then we will meet them," he replied. Orders were given to fortify the capital and recall distant garrisons. The city prepared, its gates reinforced, its walls manned day and night. Far beyond the walls, Rowan watched the dawn rise over his assembled forces. The time for hiding had ended. The road ahead would lead to battle, and to the throne that had been taken from his father. The army of the resistance reached the plains before the capital at dawn. Mist lay across the fields, and the great walls of Valina rose in the distance, cold and silent. Rowan stood at the front beside Thomas, watching as the first light touched the stone towers. This was the city where he had been born, though he remembered none of it. Now he had returned, not as a child, but as a man leading an army. Across the field, Victor's forces formed in ranks beyond the gates. Banners lifted in the wind, and the sound of drums rolled across the plain like distant thunder. "There is no turning back now," Thomas said quietly. Rowan nodded. "I never intended to turn back." The battle began with the rising sun. Arrows darkened the sky, and the sound of steel echoed across the field. It was not swift like the skirmishes of the past. This was war in its full weight, shields locked, lines pushing forward, men fighting not for pay or orders, but for the lives waiting behind them. Rowan fought at the front, his movement steady, his voice carrying above the noise as he called orders and rallied the line. Wherever the resistance faltered, he was there, holding them firm. By midday, neither side had broken. The field was scarred and silent in places where fighting had passed, but the gates of the capital still stood closed. As the sun began to sink, both armies withdrew to their camps, exhausted but unbroken. The first battle had ended without victory. But everyone knew the next would decide everything. Night settled heavily over the plains outside the capital. Fires burned in both camps, but the usual sounds of laughter and talk were absent. Men sharpened blades in silence, wrote brief letters, or sat staring into the flames, each alone with his thoughts. Rowan walked among them quietly, speaking when he was spoken to, listening more than he talked. He could feel the weight pressing on every heart. Tomorrow would decide the fate of the kingdom, and everyone knew it. Thomas found him standing at the edge of the camp, looking toward the distant walls of Valina. "You should rest," Thomas said. Rowan shook his head. "I don't think I could." For a time, they stood in silence. At last Thomas spoke again. "Your father stood in this same place once," he said softly. "Not on this field, but in spirit. He believed a king must carry the fears of his people so they do not have to." Rowan felt the words settle within him. He had never known Aldrich, yet sometimes he felt as if his father's presence walked beside him in moments like this. In the capital, Victor also stood awake, watching the fires of the resistance flicker in the darkness. He knew the coming battle would decide not only his throne but his life. Lucan entered the chamber. "At dawn," the prince said simply. Victor nodded. Outside, the wind moved across the plain, cold and restless. And the kingdom waited for the morning. Dawn came cold and clear. The horns of both armies sounded across the plains, and the final battle began. This time there was no hesitation, no testing of strength. Both sides knew the end had arrived. The fighting was fierce and relentless. Lines broke and reformed, banners fell, and the air filled with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. Rowan moved through the battle with calm determination, rallying his soldiers wherever the line began to falter. Near midday, the gates of the capital opened, and Victor himself rode out, armored and grim. Beside him rode Lucan, his sword already drawn. The two armies seemed to fade as Rowan rode forward to meet them. For a moment, the noise of the battle felt distant, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Victor looked at Rowan with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. "Aldric's son," he said quietly. "I thought the fire had claimed you." "It claimed only your honor," Rowan replied. The duel was swift and brutal. Victor fought with strength born of years of command, but time and pride had slowed him. Rowan's movements were steady, disciplined, and unyielding. At last, Victor fell. Lucan, seeing his father dead, charged in fury. But rage made his strikes reckless, and within moments he too lay defeated upon the field. A silence spread slowly across the battlefield as the soldiers of the capital began to lay down their arms. The war was over. And the throne of Valina stood empty once more. The gates of Valina opened at last. Rowan entered the city not at the head of a conquering army, but on foot, walking slowly through streets filled with silent citizens. Some watched from windows, uncertain and wary. Others stepped forward cautiously, as if afraid the moment might vanish like a dream. The palace stood as it had on the night it burned, rebuilt in stone, yet carrying the memory of fire in every shadow. Rowan paused at the great doors before entering, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had been lost within those walls. Inside the throne hall, the crown of Valina rested upon a table of dark wood, guarded but untouched since Victor's fall. Thomas stood beside it, his expression calm but solemn. "It belongs to you," he said. Rowan looked at the crown for a long moment. He remembered the villages, the fields, the people who had suffered, and the father he had never known. The crown was not glory. It was responsibility. At last, he lifted it and placed it upon his head. No cheers filled the hall. No music sounded. Only a quiet stillness, as if the kingdom itself were breathing again after years of holding its breath. That evening, Rowan stood upon the palace balcony and looked out over the city. Lights flickered in the streets, and for the first time in many years, they felt like lights of hope rather than fear. The rightful king had returned. But the work of healing a kingdom had only just begun. The weeks after the war were quieter than Rowan had expected. There were no celebrations that lasted for days, no grand parades or triumphal songs. The kingdom had suffered too long for joy to come easily. Instead, there was work, endless work, to mend what had been broken. Rowan spent his days listening. Farmers came to speak of ruined fields, merchants of empty roads, and families of those who had been taken and never returned. He heard every story, never rushing, never turning away. A king, he had learned, must first understand before he commands. Taxes were reduced. Forced labor was ended. Soldiers were sent not to punish, but to rebuild bridges, repair roads, and protect the harvest. Slowly, the land began to breathe again. Thomas remained beside Rowan, no longer a captain, but a trusted advisor. Sometimes, when the council hall was empty and the evening light faded through the windows, Thomas would watch Rowan in silence. "You have become the king your father hoped you would be," he said once. Rowan did not answer at once. "I only try to be worthy of those who believed in me," he replied. Beyond the palace, the people of Alina began to speak of the future instead of the past. Markets filled, children played openly in the streets, and travelers once again moved safely along the roads. The kingdom was not yet whole. Scars remained, and memories would take years to fade. But hope had returned. And hope, Rowan knew, was stronger than any sword. 1 year after the war, Rowan returned to Rensford. He did not come with banners or soldiers, only with Thomas and a small escort who waited at the edge of the village. Rowan walked the familiar road alone, past the fields where he had once worked, past the forge where sparks had once lit the cold air. The village had changed little. Smoke still rose from chimneys, and children still ran through the narrow lanes. For a moment, Rowan felt as if he had stepped back into another life. Mara stood in the doorway of the small stone house, as if she had known he would come. Time had lined her face, but her eyes were the same. "You have done what I always hoped," she said softly. Rowan smiled. "I only walked the path you saved for me." They sat together by the fire as evening fell, speaking not of war or crowns, but of simple things, the harvest, the weather, the small details of life that kings rarely hear. Rowan realized that this quiet place had shaped him as much as any throne ever could. When he rose to leave, Mara placed the old ring in his hand. "You no longer need this to remember who you are," she said. "The kingdom already knows." Rowan stepped outside into the cool night. The stars above Rensford were the same ones he had watched as a boy, long before he knew he was a prince. For a moment, he stood in silence, remembering the servant he had once been, and the king he had become. And he understood at last that the crown did not make the man. The journey did.